My name is Anderson Cooper, and tonight I want to start where the headlines didn't. While most people were watching stock tickers and election polls, a quiet notice was filed in Ottawa. No dramatic press conference. No urgent breaking news banner. Just a regulatory decision that effectively blocked a wave of U.S. steel imports from entering Canada. On the surface, it looked procedural, technical, almost boring. But history tells us that the most dangerous shifts in global power rarely announce themselves with fireworks. They begin like this, small, quiet, almost invisible, until suddenly they are unavoidable. Here is the moment most commentators missed. Canada did not frame this as retaliation. It framed it as protection. Protection of domestic capacity. Protection of supply chains. Protection of what policymakers now openly call economic sovereignty. That single word should make you pause. Because when a country that built its prosperity on open trade starts invoking sovereignty in industrial policy, something deeper has already broken. This is not about steel prices alone. It is not about who sells cheaper rebar or whose mills are more efficient this quarter. This is a philosophical clash between two visions of order. On one side, institutional stability, the idea that rules, agreements, and predictable trade flows prevent chaos. On the other, market volatility, where speed, scale, and aggressive advantage define survival. For decades, North America pretended these two visions were compatible. They are not, and now the contradiction is exposed. The real conflict sits beneath the surface. Canada's move signals a loss of faith. Faith that the U.S. market will remain predictable. Faith that trade agreements will be honored in spirit, not just in legal wording. Faith that allies will not weaponize scale against partners. When that faith erodes, law replaces trust, and law is always slower, harsher, and more defensive. What makes this moment explosive is the timing. Global steel is already distorted by subsidies, overcapacity, and geopolitical hedging. China reshaped the market years ago. Europe followed with defensive measures. Now North America is turning inward, not loudly, but deliberately. And when neighbors start building economic walls, even partial ones, the shock waves travel fast. Ask yourself something simple. If steel, the backbone of infrastructure, becomes a battleground, what comes next? Energy? Food? Technology? Once the logic of protection takes hold, it rarely stops where it begins. This is the end point the cameras didn't show you. A trade relationship once sold as unshakable is now being stress-tested in real time. And the outcome will not be decided by speeches, but by mechanisms, loopholes, and pressure points hidden deep inside the system. To understand why this moment feels sudden, but is anything but, you have to go back decades to a time when North American trade was treated almost as a law of nature. Free flow, comparative advantage, efficiency above all else. Steel crossed borders so often that its origins stopped matching. A slab poured in Ohio, rolled in Ontario. Fabricated in Quebec, installed in Texas. The system worked because everyone agreed not to ask hard questions. And that, in retrospect, was the original mistake. For years, warnings were dismissed as protectionist paranoia. Domestic steel producers complained about dumping, about subsidies hidden behind foreign accounting, about national security risks tied to industrial hollowing. They were told to innovate or die. Consumers enjoyed cheaper prices. Governments enjoyed political calm. The problem was not ignored because it was invisible. It was ignored because confronting it meant admitting that efficiency had quietly replaced resilience as the highest value. Then the structure began to crack. The U.S. started using trade law not just as defense, but as leverage. Section 232 tariffs reframed steel as a security asset. Exemptions became bargaining chips. Quotas replaced trust. Canada watched closely, publicly calm, privately alarmed. Because once trade becomes conditional on political alignment, allies are no longer partners. They are variables. Here is where the mechanics matter. Canada didn't slam the door shut overnight. It used safeguard measures, anti-circumvention rules, and compliance thresholds buried deep in trade legislation. On paper, this is lawful. It follows WTO language. It respects process. But functionally, it changes the game. Steel that enters Canada must now prove origin, pricing integrity, and end-use justification in ways that dramatically slow volume. This is not a ban. It is friction, and friction in trade is often more powerful than prohibition. Why does that matter? Because markets hate uncertainty more than cost. A U.S. exporter can absorb a tariff. What it cannot absorb is unpredictability, delays at the border, retroactive penalties, shifting compliance standards. Contracts become riskier. Financing becomes more expensive. Suddenly, Canadian buyers look inward. Domestic mills gain leverage. This is policy by pressure, not proclamation. Who wins here in the short term? Canadian producers stabilize capacity. Politicians gain the image of defending national industry. Who loses? U.S. exporters, obviously, but also downstream manufacturers caught between higher input costs and fixed contracts. And somewhere in the middle sits the worker, invisible in the spreadsheets but central to the outcome. But there's a dangerous counterforce building. The United States has tools of its own. Retaliation is easy. Escalation is familiar. The question is not whether it can respond. The question is whether it should. At what point does defending domestic industry become mutual economic self-harm? And more importantly, who pays first when that line is crossed? Here is where the story stops being abstract and starts becoming uncomfortable. Because trade policy is often discussed as if it floats above daily life, but in reality it lands with precision on very ordinary people. Before we get there, though, we need to look at the deeper mechanics that are now driving this escalation, the ones rarely explained because they expose how fragile the system has become. Steel is not just another commodity. It is financed months before it is delivered, insured across borders, and priced through long-term contracts that assume stability. When Canada tightens import controls, banks quietly reprice risk. Letters of credit cost more. Insurance premiums rise. Smaller exporters struggle to secure financing at all. This is how a policy decision in Ottawa ripples into boardrooms in Pittsburgh and union halls in Hamilton. Not overnight, but relentlessly. The turning point came when compliance stopped being neutral. Canadian authorities began scrutinizing transshipment, steel routed through third countries to mask origin. On paper, this targets unfair practices. In reality, it casts a wide net that catches legitimate trade. The legal mechanism is subtle but devastating. If origin cannot be proven to a new, stricter standard, shipments are delayed or rejected. No accusation is needed. Suspicion alone is enough. That is power exercised through procedure. Who benefits from this environment? Large corporations with legal teams, diversified supply chains, and political access. Who suffers? Mid-sized firms, independent fabricators, workers whose livelihoods depend on steady throughput. This is the quiet inequality embedded in modern trade wars. They do not destroy economies evenly. They select their victims. Now, picture the human scale. A construction worker in Ontario starts seeing projects delayed because steel deliveries are uncertain. Overtime disappears. A manufacturing employee in the U.S. Midwest hears rumors that Canadian contracts may not be renewed. A family delays a major purchase. A mortgage suddenly feels heavier. Is this what economic sovereignty looks like on the ground? Who decided this trade-off? Zoom out further, and the geopolitical consequences sharpen. Allies watching this dispute take notes. If Canada can shield its steel industry against U.S. pressure, others may follow. Europe already has. Asia is preparing. The global trading system, once anchored in predictability, is fragmenting into zones of managed friction, not isolation, but conditional access. And that is far harder to reverse. The obstacle now is credibility. Canada insists this is defensive. The U.S. sees precedent. Once trust breaks at this level, every future negotiation is poisoned by memory, and trust, unlike tariffs, cannot be recalibrated with a vote. So here's the question that should haunt policymakers. When protection becomes normalized, does it actually protect the people it claims to serve? Or does it simply shift risk downward, away from governments, and onto households least able to absorb it? The answer to that will define what comes next, not just for steel, but for the entire economic order we are quietly dismantling. At this stage, The escalation stops being a bilateral disagreement and starts resembling a stress test of governance itself. Because once both sides understand mechanics, the temptation is no longer to resolve the issue, but to outmaneuver the other. And that is where long-term stability is usually sacrificed for short-term leverage. The United States does not lack options. It can challenge Canada through formal dispute channels, delay approvals in adjacent sectors, or apply pressure through regulatory symmetry. None of this requires a public trade war announcement. It can all be done quietly, legally, and deniably. This is how modern economic conflict is fought. Not with tariffs alone, but with process, delay, and selective enforcement. The danger is that every move teaches the other side how to respond more aggressively next time. Here is the counterpoint that complicates the narrative. Canada's steel industry is not a fragile relic. It is capital-intensive, technologically advanced, and politically sensitive. Letting it erode would mean dependence on external supply during crises. Pandemics expose that risk. Wars reinforced it. From that perspective, this policy looks responsible, even necessary. But responsibility without coordination becomes unilateralism. And unilateralism between allies carries a cost that spreadsheets cannot fully capture. Now watch how the burden shifts. Large multinationals adapt. They reroute supply chains, renegotiate contracts, lobby governments. The real pressure falls on small municipalities waiting for infrastructure upgrades, on private builders facing cost overruns, on workers whose schedules become unpredictable. These are not abstract losses. They show up as delayed bridges, postponed housing, shrinking paychecks. This is the hidden tax of trade conflict. Globally, the signal is unmistakable. The era of trust-based trade is ending. What replaces it is a system where access is conditional on political alignment, compliance posture, and strategic value. Countries outside North America are adjusting. Some see opportunity. Others see risk. All see instability. And instability raises prices everywhere. There's also a psychological shift underway. When citizens hear leaders speak of sovereignty and protection, expectations change. People begin to believe higher prices are the price of safety. But is that consent informed? Or is it manufactured through fear? How much volatility are households expected to absorb for policies they had no voice in shaping? This is the moral tension at the heart of the issue. Governance is not just about defending national interests. It is about choosing who carries the cost of that defense. Right now, that cost is being distributed downward, quietly, efficiently, and without debate. And this is where the path forward narrows. Either this conflict is managed through transparency and coordination, or becomes another chapter in a broader retreat from cooperation. History suggests the latter is easier, politically safer, and economically more damaging. So the question becomes unavoidable. Are leaders using trade policy to build resilience for their citizens or to shield themselves from accountability? Because once economic conflict becomes normalized, reversing it requires courage few systems are designed to reward. There's a moment in every economic confrontation when the numbers stop adding up, not because the math is wrong, but because the assumptions behind it no longer hold. That moment is now. The assumption that trade disputes can be contained, that they can be calibrated like interest rates and adjusted without collateral damage, is breaking down in real time. Consider what happens next at ground level. A mid-sized Canadian manufacturer signs a contract assuming stable steel input costs. Weeks later, delivery timelines stretch. Prices inch upward, not dramatically but persistently. Margins thin. Hiring plans are paused. A U.S. supplier, facing uncertainty at the border, redirects capacity elsewhere. No press release marks this shift. Jobs simply fail to materialize. Is this a crisis if no one announces it? Or is it worse because it feels invisible? This is where the winners and losers become brutally clear. Financial institutions, trading desks, and vertically integrated giants adapt fastest. They price in volatility. They profit from it. Meanwhile, households experience volatility as anxiety, variable hours, rising costs, a sense that decisions made far away are shaping their future without explanation. That gap between decision maker and consequence is where democratic trust erodes. The strategic obstacle now looming is escalation fatigue. Governments know retaliation invites counter-retaliation, but stepping back risks appearing weak. So the conflict drifts unresolved, accumulating damage like rust. Infrastructure projects cost more. Housing becomes less affordable. Public patience thins. And still, the core dispute remains framed as technical, not moral. On the global chessboard, other powers are watching closely. If North American allies cannot manage industrial disputes without harming their own citizens, what lesson does that teach emerging economies? That rules are flexible. That power matters more than partnership. That resilience is something you hoard, not share. This is how fragmentation accelerates. Now ask yourself a harder question. When leaders speak of protecting workers, which workers are they talking about? The ones in press conferences, or the ones adjusting household budgets late at night? Because protection that raises living costs faster than wages is not protection. It is redistribution without consent. The moral hazard here is subtle. Trade conflict allows governments to blame external forces for internal failures. Inflation becomes imported. Job losses become collateral. Accountability dissolves. And citizens are left navigating complexity they never agreed to manage. This is no longer just about steel. It is about whether modern governance can balance strategic necessity with human reality, whether policymakers can defend national capacity without turning everyday life into a series of economic shocks. And that leads to the question no one wants to answer openly. If stability requires cooperation, and cooperation requires trust, what happens when trust is the first thing sacrificed? Because once that foundation is gone, rebuilding it costs far more than any tariff ever collected. By now, a pattern should be unmistakable. What began as a targeted trade action has evolved into a system-wide recalibration of risk, responsibility, and expectation. And like all recalibrations, it favors those closest to the controls. The rest absorb the vibration. There's a scene playing out quietly across North America. A logistics manager refreshes a dashboard, watching shipment statuses linger in limbo. A procurement officer rewrites forecasts for the third time in a month. A worker hears that a plant will run shorter shifts, not because demand collapsed, but because inputs became unreliable. These moments never trend online, yet they define the lived reality of economic policy. The geopolitical implications now stretch well beyond Canada and the United States. Steel is foundational to defense, energy, and infrastructure. When its trade becomes politicized, alliances recalibrate, partners hedge, neutral states leverage uncertainty. Supply chains that once optimized for cost now optimize for alignment. This is how economic blocks harden without treaties. There's also a legal aftershock. Each safeguard measure, each compliance tightening becomes precedent. Other sectors take note. Aluminum today, semiconductors tomorrow, food security the day after. The logic spreads, and with it spreads a normalization of exception. Emergency measures become permanent. Oversight fades. Citizens are told this is necessary. Necessary for whom? The philosophical fault line is now fully visible. Stability demands predictability, shared rules, and restraint. Volatility rewards speed, leverage, and unilateral action. Governments claim to pursue stability, but increasingly govern through volatility. Why? Because volatility can be blamed. Stability requires ownership. And here is the uncomfortable truth. Citizens are being asked to accept uncertainty as patriotism, higher prices as resilience, fewer choices as security. But consent requires understanding. How many people were asked if this was an acceptable trade-off? How many were even told it was happening? This is where governance either proves its legitimacy or exposes its limits. Transparency would mean admitting costs up front. Coordination would mean sharing burden across borders. Instead, we see fragmentation managed through silence. History is unforgiving with systems that normalize quiet harm. They don't collapse dramatically. They erode. Trust weakens. Participation declines. Cynicism grows. And when a real crisis arrives, there is nothing left to mobilize. So the final tension sharpens. Trade policy is no longer just an economic tool. It is a test of whether democratic societies can navigate strategic competition without sacrificing the people they claim to protect. The question now is not whether this conflict can be de-escalated. It is whether leaders still remember why de-escalation matters. Because once volatility becomes a governing principle, stability is no longer something you defend. It is something you remember. There's a final layer to the story that rarely makes it into policy briefings, because it forces a reckoning with power itself. Not power as strength, but power as responsibility. And this is where the Canada U.S. steel confrontation reveals its most unsettling truth. Economic decisions today are engineered to feel inevitable. Leaders speak in a language of constraints, of global pressures, of forces beyond control. But this is a choice. Canada chose friction over accommodation. The United States chose leverage over reassurance. Each step was legal. Each step was rational. And yet, collectively, they form a system where no one feels accountable for the outcome. That is how governance quietly hollows out. Look at the citizens standing in the middle of this. They are told their country must be competitive, secure, resilient. They're also told to accept higher costs, delayed projects, and unstable employment as temporary side effects. Temporary becomes permanent very quickly in economic policy. At what point does patience turn into resignation? At what point does resilience become endurance without reward? On the global stage, this moment is being interpreted as a signal of maturity or decay. Can advanced democracies manage industrial competition without turning inward? Can allies disagree without punishing their own populations? Or is the future one of permanent low-grade economic conflict, where every sector is a pressure point waiting to be exploited? There is also a generational dimension. Younger workers inherit an economy defined by instability. Older workers remember one built on predictability. When leaders normalize volatility, they shape expectations for decades. A society that expects disruption stops demanding protection. That is a profound shift in the social contract. And yet, this outcome is not fixed. De-escalation does not require weakness. It requires coordination, transparency, and the courage to admit trade-offs honestly. It requires treating citizens not as buffers, but as stakeholders. That is the difference between governance and management. So ask yourself and ask those in power, who is this system designed to serve? Who absorbs the cost when strategy fails? And why are those questions so rarely answered directly? Because the true danger here is not a trade war. It is the normalization of decisions that affect millions, made in rooms where no one has to explain the consequences out loud. This is where the story must end, not with certainty, but with responsibility. Because the Canada U.S. steel standoff is not a glitch in the system. It is the system revealing itself. A system where economic power is exercised indirectly, where consequences are diffused, and where accountability is often the first casualty. What citizens deserve in moments like this is not reassurance. It is clarity. Clarity about who benefits, who pays, and why this path was chosen over others. Stability is not the absence of conflict. It is the presence of trust. Trust that decisions are made with full awareness of their human cost. Trust that protection does not become a slogan used to justify silent sacrifice. Governance, at its best, aligns strategy with lived reality. It acknowledges that markets exist to serve societies, not the other way around. When trade policy undermines household security, employment predictability, and long-term planning, it stops being strategic and starts being extractive. The lesson here is not that borders should close or that markets should run wild. It is that power exercised without transparency erodes legitimacy, even when intentions are defensible. Citizens are not obstacles to be managed. They are the reason stability matters in the first place. So the final question is simple, and it belongs to everyone watching. What do we expect from those who govern in our name? Do we accept quiet volatility as the price of influence? Or do we demand a model of leadership that treats economic security as a shared responsibility, not a bargaining chip? Because trade wars end. Steel prices fluctuate. But the damage done to trust, once normalized, is far harder to repair. And societies that forget this lesson often learn it again at a far higher cost.